We're revisiting how you design campaigns, and with this new approach, you might find it easier than you think. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of How to Be a Great GM. My name is Guy, and today's episode is brought to you by World Anvil. I mentioned this up front because, well, in the next couple weeks, starting from next week, Wednesday, as of this video, I'm going to be doing a live stream in the evenings for about an hour or so at around about 7 p.m. GMT. Check the details down below. Time zones have changed and all that kind of wonderful stuff. But next week, Wednesday, I kick off a 4-part series where I will design the campaign that I'm going to be talking about in today's video using the World Anvil stuff, simply because it makes it so much easier to control and navigate. The more information about World Anvil at the end of today's video. So let's get into it. We're talking about designing campaigns. Where do you start? What do you do? There's so many questions that come into mind when you think about a campaign. And when you also think about it, you've got to look at the system that you're playing, and you have to look at your players. There is no point in designing a campaign that your players are simply never going to want to play. Trust me, I have been there and I have done that, where you have spent countless weeks or hours or minutes thinking about a new campaign, only to find that your players go, you know what, don't like this actually, don't like this. So then you throw it out the window and you have to start again. So we start, as far as I'm concerned, with looking at what you have available to you. Now, if you're running a Dungeons & Dragons campaign, you could set it in a sci-fi universe campaign style if you really wanted to try and push that envelope, but you're going to have to make sure that your players are happy with that as well. So once you've worked out roughly your space that you're going to be playing, and we're going to be playing in a fantasy world, or we're going to be playing in a science fiction world, or we're going to be playing in this, or we're going to be doing it in that, we're going to be looking at all those kinds of components that will then shape your campaign. So you assemble that kind of stuff. Now, if you have players that are particularly aggressive players, they like to kill things, they expect combat in every single session, then you need to design a campaign that's going to allow for that. If you have players like the majority of my players, where they expect combat maybe once every 3 or 4 sessions, if they're lucky they don't get a lot of combat, then I have a very different style and approach. If you have players who are problem solvers and love to get into the actual politics and the story of the game, that's also something to take into consideration. What we're going to do is we're going to take all of those different components and we're going to combine them together. And we're going to combine them together around a single question, or at least we're going to shape the question that we ask when we ask it, based on what we have gathered from everybody, from all of the other areas, the system, the genre, the style, the tone, all that kind of stuff. So the question that we ask, we've asked this question before, is what if? And it's a very useful question in terms of thinking outside of your box. Now, when you ask the what if question, the appropriate thing to do is to say, okay, with all of the previous knowledge that I've gained, it's a fantasy setting, it's a political setting, that's the bits that I've got to work with. And I've got players who love role-playing. Okay, what if the players were involved in politics at the highest level? What if they are senators, or if they are princes? How does that affect it? If they are lords and ladies of the realm? If they are, what is the appropriate question that you should be asking? What if they are commoners, but you want them ultimately to rise to being king and queen? What would that journey be like? When you look at the story of King Arthur, for example, that's that exact question. What if a relative nobody suddenly became king of England? What would they do? What does that journey look like? And you get Disney's Sword in the Stone, still one of my favorite animated films of all time. Now, you ask that what if question and you try different things to fit the criterion that you have already established. What if this? What if that? What if the next thing? Now, the campaign world that I'm going to be designing in that live show that I was speaking about, and don't worry if you can't catch the live show, the videos will be here on this channel for viewing later on. The question I asked is, what if the world that I want my campaign to be set in, what if it's a dumping ground for other worlds and they just deposit entire cultures or individuals into this world that they don't need or want or have expelled for various reasons, and there are portals that just eject individuals, groups of people, 1,000 people at a time randomly. It's an interesting premise to a degree. So how do we then test our idea? So we've got our what if this, what if that, what if the next thing? How do we test that? How do we make sure that that question then is going to be useful as a campaign? Because you might ask the question, what if the players were kings and queens? But unless you can answer the next question, it's not going to help you make a campaign. And the next question is, what stories, what adventures can I think of that come from that idea of what if? So what if the players are kings and queens? How does that affect the entire narrative? What is that narrative? Are there going to be kings and queens of powerful nations? Are there going to be kings and queens of weak nations? Are there going to be kings and queens that have no actual say, so they can't leave the castle? Your Majesty, it would be inappropriate for you to lead the armies into the battles. That's why we have your generals. The generals lead the armies. Would a king, would a queen go on espionage missions? Would they seek to do things in the shadows? Maybe, but at the same time, maybe not. Maybe that's too grand and it restricts you. So what adventures come out of being a king? Well, sneaking out of the castle, impersonating a commoner so you can get the general feeling of your troops. But if a king is gone for too long without his castle or his viziers or whomever is running things knowing what's going on, that can be incredibly risky. So that's an interesting premise, but is it a strong one? No, I don't think so. But what if they're princes and princesses? What if they have a vested interest in the realm being safe, but they're not running the realm? Now let's see what adventures we get from that. Well, they can be dispatched as envoys to other nations on behalf of the king or the queen. They can conduct espionage missions. They can mix with the commoners, just as the king and queen could. But now if they're gone for a few days, that's okay. And it creates more adventures because now the king gets worried. Maybe my prince or princess or whatever title you want to give them is actually being abducted because they haven't come back yet. That's an interesting one. Okay, well then let's do X or Y or Z. I mean, so the point is you test to see what sort of adventures immediately pop into your mind based on your what if question. So with the prince and princess idea, I think that works quite well given the fact that there are quite a few that start to come through there. Now, the next question that you have to ask yourself, and this is because it is going to make your life so much easier in terms of designing this entire campaign. Where can you draw inspiration from? In other words, where can you steal from? Now, when you are designing a campaign, invariably there will be some films or books or plays or comic books or manga or whatever out there that contains a story similar to yours. We're just not that original as humans, I'm sorry to say it. But that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. So surround yourself with material that gives you inspiration. So if it's a prince or a princess story, go and watch The Prince's Bride and see what sort of adventures that happens. It's an interesting example, by the way, because if we are following the Prince Humperdinck story, he has very little to do, as a matter of fact. But he's a very good villain. So maybe your what-if scenario is that they're fighting against another prince or another king. Well, there's inspiration. So try and find as much inspiration as you possibly can think of. Try and figure that one out. Once you've done that, once you've kind of got, okay, I've got all of my resources, I've got my idea, I've got my what-if, I've got my basic idea for my campaign, I have some broad stroke kind of stuff. What's next? Well, next is deciding on the style of your campaign. Now, previously I've spoken about the 4 different types of campaigns that are out there. There's actually 5. You have to choose which style is going to be most appropriate for you. Is it going to be something that's just episodic, and that the heroes, the princes and princesses, will face minor challenges throughout the course of their adventures? This week it's some hag trying to take over the kingdom. Next week it's this, or the week after it's that. You have to decide which course of action you want to take. Is it going to be an epic campaign where you plot out this journey where the prince and princesses eventually unite the kingdom into a single whole and become emperor and empress? It's entirely up to you where you want to go. You need to determine, though, what type of campaign you're going to be having so that you know where you're going. Again, if it's episodic, that's absolutely fine. Let them fight a monster this week, let them fight something else next week. Maybe it's an avalanche this month as the primary protagonist, the following month is villain. You do you. All right? Once you've then done that, you've figured out, okay, it's not episodic, it's actually based on the characters, or it's based on a big epic campaign, etc., 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 etc. You're nearly there. You really are nearly there. You then need to decide on what is the goal of the campaign. Now, this is something that I didn't really speak about in the 4 types of campaign videos that I posted up a couple of weeks ago. What the goal of the campaign is or should be is effectively, well, why are we playing this campaign? So yes, you've got your prince and princess. The what if question has been answered. You've got your notion that, it's going to be pretty much episodic. What's the goal? Is the goal to explore what it's like to be a king or a queen or a prince or a princess? Is the goal to struggle over the resources? Is the goal to micromanage the wool trade and taxation on the wool trade? What is the goal? And the reason why you have to identify your goal, and it could be as simple as introduce my players to a new fantasy world, or to the new world that I have created, or to the new role-playing system that we're going to be using to run this game in. It could be as simple as that. It could be much more complicated. It's entirely up to you. I say simpler is always better. And the reason why you need to have a goal is because unless you have an epic campaign where there is an ultimate big bad that needs to be defeated by the player characters, the guys are going to be going, okay, well, this is cool, this is cool. You are going to be sitting there going, oh, this is cool, but I have no idea where we should be going. I don't know what's going to happen next because I don't have a goal. So identify your goal and say, well, this campaign is just to have fun, and I think it's going to run for like 10 sessions, maybe 15, I don't know. I've jotted down some what-if scenarios. You know, if they're prince and princesses, we've got an espionage mission, we've got an undercover mission, we've got a diplomatic incident mission, we've got this, we've got a wedding, we've got a this, da, 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 da. So I've got about 12 adventures. If that's your goal, just to run 12 adventures, then make it guide you, and not restrict you, but make it guide you. So at the end of 12 sessions, you sit back and you go, well, I've kind of done my 12 adventures. I've done my 12 adventures. That was my goal. Do I now need to establish another goal, which would be to run another 24 adventures, or are we done? And if you're done, end it. That's it. Game over, folks. Thanks for playing. You live happily ever after in those castles that you've now ruined because of the siege that you started and then didn't finish because you got distracted with the beholder gold and the da-da-da-da-da. By having a goal, it gives you parameters, and it allows you to know where those parameters are. There are times where you go, I'm so over this campaign, but my goal was to test out the system. Have I tested out the system? Yes, I have. Okay, next session, I'm going to wrap it up in a nice, juicy way. You always want to leave your players asking for more, because ultimately that's the mark, I think, of a great GM, is when your players go, what do you mean? What are we going to play next week? I want to carry on playing my character. That's what you really want. It's at that point that you reassess. So if you have got to the end of your goal and your players are going, no, we want more, mate. This is not on. We want more. Then sit back and say, okay, well, what more is there? What more can I add in? What can I do? How can I? That's what you then do. And you set another goal. It could be a micro goal. Okay, we're going to do one more adventure in this realm and then we're going to move on. Let your players know that, though. Let them understand that. Again, depending on your particular goal. Okay, Once you have established your goal and you've established all of those other wonderful things, there are a few questions that you still have to ask. And probably you should ask these before you set your goal. Well, I don't know. It's always tricky. I mean, it's a bit of a chicken and an egg story, really. Would a chicken fry an egg or would a chicken boil an egg? You just never know. You have to ask the question, why would my players want to play in this campaign? It has to be there. You've plotted out everything. Well, not plotted out. Let me rephrase that. You've got your what if and a chain of events. You've got some scenarios. You've got some adventure ideas in your head. Because what I'm also advocating is you shouldn't put in a huge amount of work at this point. This should all be a thought experiment or maybe a spider splodge diagram type thing on a piece of paper or on your phone, wherever. I mean, it's up to you. You shouldn't put in a lot of effort at this point. If you cannot answer the question, why would your players want to play in this game? You shouldn't run it. You really shouldn't run it. And it's as simple as, well, I think being a prince or princess would be cool. And with the adventures that I've got planned for them, they're not too restricted. They're not going to be locked down at every door. No, Your Majesty, you can't leave the castle. Remember this, remember that. They're not going to have that happen. There's a new TV series out called The Irregulars where the prince is not allowed out of the castle. So he leaves anyway and then stays away for days on end and there's no repercussions whatsoever. That's a sloppy GM going, oh no, well, we've set up that you can't leave the castle because we wanted adversity. But then once they did, then there were no consequences to it. And you go, well, yeah, that's just bad GMing, in my opinion. So instead say, well, you are allowed to leave the castle, Your Majesty, but do remember you're having breakfast with the Queen tomorrow morning, and then you have your 11 o'clock engagement with the Earl of Doncaster, and just remember you've got this and you've got that and you've got the next thing. The PCs don't show up, you have to then decide the consequences. But those consequences can't be you're grounded for 6 months, because then the campaign ends. Or the PCs escape, and then your hand is being forced to, you're no longer the prince of the realm, you've been exiled. Whatever. And then they have to do some sort of interview, and then people are going to debate about the contents of the interview and wait for the king or the queen to make a speech about the interview, and it just gets nasty. You don't want to do that. So why are the PCs going to want to be in that realm? Why are the players going to want to play in that realm? You have to answer that question truthfully and honestly. It's up to you as to whether you're going to give yourself a correct answer or not. Do not get too wrapped up in your own ideas, though. Again, it's about asking the players, hey guys, what do you feel if you guys were nobility and you had vast resources under your command? There's nothing wrong with asking a question like that to your players. Just send them a WhatsApp, what do you guys think? And they're like, maybe not, maybe, I'm not sure. Anyway, that's feedback that you get. Once you have all of that, that's then when you start to sit down and you take your what if question and you take your adventure ideas and you take your style of game, whether it's epic or episodic or just random or player driven, you take that kind of information and then you start sitting down and you say, okay, right, so the players are going to be nobility. Now I need to start developing the actual space in which they're going to play. And I think a lot of people take this final step for granted because it's not the final step, as a matter of fact. It is the very first step, in my opinion, on creating a good campaign. Now, when you look at existing campaign settings that are out there, they frequently have a huge amount of world building that's gone on behind the scenes, and that's just mentioned in the flavor text. If you are creating a campaign from scratch and you are setting it in a world that you own and that you control, you then have to create parts of that world. You don't have to create the whole world, you can just create pieces that you need for now. No one is going to sit back and say, yes, but this province has this technology and that province over there doesn't, but they're right next to each other. And that'll come up in the game, and then you can figure out reasons why they don't have that technology. It could be cultural, religious, spiritual. There could be a whole bunch of reasons why they're not sharing information. The point is that now you start to build out your space, and you say, okay, well, if they're a prince or if they're a princess, they need to have a realm. Because I want the players to work together, they could either all be blood relatives, which is fine, but bearing in mind, the implication of that is that your players will all have to play the same race, which could be an issue, Or you need to figure out how is it that a prince, a human prince, an orcish princess, and a gnomish matriarch, how are they all working together? Is there an alliance that's been formed? So now you start to develop out your world so that you can start to make notes and you can start to design things. It depends on the campaign that you are creating, but ultimately you always need to establish the situation that the player characters find themselves in. Even if they're commoners, what is the village? What is the town? What is the area that they're looking at? And that's when you start to really get into the developmental stage. Again, we're still not talking a huge amount of developmental stuff. You have to generate a lot of material, that is true, but only within the space of your campaign. There's no point in developing it beyond that. And if the players do go beyond that, make it up as you go along. It's really not that difficult. You know your space, you know your world, and you know your goal of the campaign. So that goal is really going to come back and help you. That is how you start to develop your grand campaign. Again, the most important thing, and I think I need to stress this, is you are designing something that players are going to interact with, and they are going to change, and they are going to break. And by break, I mean interact and adjust. And they're bringing their own goals, their own personalities, and their own stories to the table. There is no point in you developing intricate stories if it's not going to be used. If you are having princes and princesses, do you need to develop 1,000 heraldries on either side so they know where they're coming from? Maybe. But on the other hand, my advice would be to get the players to do that. Give me the names of lineages up to 5 ages ago. Who were their parents? Who were your parents? Who were your parents' parents? How did your family get into power? Throw that to the players. I do this whenever I'm creating a campaign. I will get bare bones stuff. I will do minimal amount of work to make the world work enough for me as the GM, and then I throw it to my players. Oh, you want to play a Goliath? Sure. Give me a little bit of information about this Goliath. What are they like? Oh, they're barbarian tribes who kind of live in mountainous regions? Okay, I have a map that I have created or will create. I'll put some mountains in, but I want you to tell me about their culture. How do they shake hands? What's their formal greeting? As a lord of this chiefdom, are you only a chief? Why would your tribe be strong enough and powerful enough to interact with this human empire that's next door to you? What do you have that they don't have? Access to the passes through the mountains. Well, that's an interesting one. Your choice, you decide on what way you want to take it. But this is your first step, as far as I'm concerned. Getting those answers to what I've just spoken about, and then you take the next ones. Again, a reminder, I'll be doing some live shows, 4-part series on how to create a campaign starting on next week, Wednesday. Information will be down below, or just hit that like button or the subscribe button or the Goblin Bell, and that will notify you when the show is happening. Before we go to World Anvil, we're going to talk about your task for today. So your task for today is you are going to create a single thread, a single idea for a campaign. And in the comments down below, so that you can get feedback, because again, the feedback is the most honest form of determining whether your idea is good. You're going to come up with an idea for a campaign. My campaign idea is the player characters are all princes and princesses. They will enjoy this because it's going to be this type of campaign. It's going to be fun. So list the campaign, list why your players would want to play it or why players would want to play it, and then give us a very brief overview. I want this campaign of your goal, that is, I want this campaign to run for 12 sessions or 12 adventures, or I want the players to discover that royalty is evil, or whatever. That's your task. Now, on to World Anvil. World Anvil is today's sponsor, and rightly so. If you are trying to create a world, create characters, create a campaign, basically create anything that requires you to write it down, World Anvil should be the place to go. Now, as per the campaign that I was talking about, I have already created a new world here. You can see the list of all of the worlds that I play in and have created thus far within World Anvil. And if we go to the articles and categories, a new feature that World Anvil has recently added is that when you create a new world, it automatically populates it with a whole bunch of article prompts for you to start filling in. So you can see there's the World Atlas information, there's the World Encyclopedia, where there are prompts for flora and fauna, deities, organizations, cultures, technology, as well as a staging area and an introduction and an idea on what you should be doing and shouldn't be doing. In other words, it is a complete guide to helping you create your world from scratch. If that isn't something that is useful, I don't know. Of course, you can load in your own maps, create timelines, create family trees, add characters, completely track your campaign. You have all kinds of tools such as stack blocks. I'll try that again, such as stat blocks. That's an interesting one. You try say it out aloud 3 times. Stat blocks, stat blocks, stat blocks. Okay, now you can. All right, fine. You get a biscuit. Calendars, charts, tables, variables, all kinds of wonderful things. Of course, you can control who has access to that world, your player characters, what they know about the world, and all those kinds of wonderful things. Nonetheless, this is World Anvil. They've made today's video possible. Big thank you to them. And of course, a big thank you to our patrons for keeping the channel going, and for all of you for watching to all the way to the end. Until next time, happy gaming.